Thank you very much. So on behalf of Liberating Cinema, my name is Mina Radovic, and I'm the founder and director of Liberating Cinema. I have the pleasure to welcome you to tonight's workshop, The Holocaust in the Czechoslovak New Wave. I will first speak a little bit about, I'll give you a bit of an introduction to the workshop, and then I will introduce our moderator for tonight and our speakers, who we're very delighted to have here, and all of you. So as one of the most important chapters in modern European history, cinema and culture, and especially cinema, have played a big role in the way we think about, study, and remember the Holocaust. The Czechoslovak cinema represents a particularly interesting case study because almost immediately after the Second World War, we have filmmakers engaging with the Holocaust, starting with films like František Čap's Men Without Wings, which shows images of the resistance, to Alfred Radok's more radical Distant Journey, which deals with the camps. And after an illustrious period in the 1950s, but an equal dip in terms of representations of the Holocaust, there was a flourishing of these representations in the 1960s with the advent of what we call and now know as the Czech New Wave. I think two things. I will allow my speakers to speak a bit more about the Czech New Wave tonight. They will give us their insights and share with us their knowledge and expertise. But two things I'd like to particularly highlight that I think are particularly significant for us tonight. First is that unlike the other major new waves of the same period, like the French New Wave, the Yugoslav New Wave, or the Black Wave as it was known, the Brazilian Cinema Novo, or even the new Latin American cinema, the Czech New Wave distinguishes itself by building on its own country's, the cinematic heritage of surrealism and the avant-garde, and then fusing it with serious subjects, including of social, political, and existential relevance. And secondly, as we come to tonight's topic, the Holocaust, there were many important filmmakers at the time who dealt with the Holocaust, from Zbyněk Brynych, Jan Kadar, Elmar Koš, and Peter Solan, and Jan Němec, as we will see tonight. They dealt with it explicitly, dealing with subjects such as life, conditions, and living conditions and events that took place under the occupation of Czechoslovakia and during the Nazi regime. But they dealt with the Holocaust also more implicitly by looking at the psychology of totalitarianism, or in other words, looking at the effect of oppressive regimes on the internal life of a person. And I hope you had the chance to watch the film Diamonds of the Night, because this is exemplary of this way of filmmaking, and also by introducing new means of expression and channeling these two concerns into film language. The Czechoslovak New Wave and the directors that came out really did something beautiful and also something radical for the time, and I think still very much important to us today. So I'm very glad to be here tonight with you, and I would like to introduce our speakers. We're very lucky to have Matěj Strnad here, who's from the Czech Film Archive. He's head of curators and also works for FIAF, and he's a graduate of FAMU, as many of the famous Czech filmmakers that we're going to talk about and the generations that came after them in Yugoslavia and beyond. Then we also have Jonathan Owen, an independent scholar from Toronto and the author of many books on Czechoslovak cinema, and a very well-known writer, pedagogue, and critic. And finally, we have Šárka Sladovníková, I hope I pronounced it right, who's also joining us from Charles University, the University of Prague. And she's a PhD candidate, a researcher, and she's the author of the book, The Holocaust in Czechoslovak Feature Films. So they'll all share with us their individual insights, and I'll hand in, and tonight I'd like also to thank my fellow members of the Board of Trustees in Liberating Cinema, Indrashish Acharya, who's joining us from India, and Dr. Stephen Martz, who will be chairing tonight's session, who is our moderator. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Martz. I'd like to particularly thank Second Run DVD, who made it possible for us to show Diamonds of the Night for the last week, and to all our panelists, to everyone else who made this possible. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Bojan Škarić from Belgrade, who made the website and everything possible. And finally, Professor Dina Jordanova, who contributed a new essay on the film Diamonds of the Night, which I will paste for you if you haven't already seen it in the chat here. So I will put that just now. You can read this essay afterwards. It's quite illuminating, and I hope you will find it beneficial. Thank you very much. I'll hand it now over to Dr. Martz, and I'd also like to welcome all our guests who are here. We have also Mr. Hans Hodo here from Interfilm. Hello, Hans. Very nice to see you. And we have several colleagues from the United States, including Professor Spolberg from Wilmington. We're glad that you're here, and several of our friends and colleagues from Belgrade. So this is great. Okay. Well, over to you, Dr. Martz.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to this wonderful evening that has been put together. Amina, you've done an exemplary job, and I want to thank everyone for showing up and our contributors tonight. Pretty straightforward format. We're going to have our three contributors provide some insight into their specialty as it relates to Diamonds in the Night and the ways in which we can explore this film together. So we'll begin with Matěj, and then we'll move to Jonathan, and then finally wrap up with Šárka. Each individual will contribute, and we'll have a chance to have questions after each one has contributed, and then we'll join back together and do a plenary session afterwards where we can see who is best suited to field particular questions. So if you want to send through the questions in the chat, that'd be great, and we can take a look. So just send it through to everyone, and I can decide, or we can even do the raise hands. We'll figure out what suits best. First up tonight is Matěj. As Mina mentioned briefly there, he's a graduate of the Center for Audiovisual Studies at FEMU in Prague. He works as the head of curators at NFA in Prague, supervising acquisition and restoration projects. He also serves as the head of programming, access to collections commission of the International Federation of Film Archives, RFF, which many of you will know. Tonight, we're happy to have him along. He's going to give a bit of an intro into NFA, what they do, and the ways in which they're seeing Czechoslovak film heritage being circulated. Diamonds of the Night, as a restored film within that, he will speak to us about, and possible approaches to other digital restorations, along with other relevant titles which have been restored or are looking to be restored by NFA. As well, he's going to look and speak to us a little bit about the production and distribution, as well as the research undertaken for Diamonds of the Night in that process that he's been involved in, and some of the specifics around the film and its restoration and its re-release. So lots of great information, I think. And without any further ado, Matěj, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Mina. Thank you for having me. And most of all, thank you for showing this film, showing our film. And that's sort of my perspective, as you, Stephen, mentioned, that I'm going to briefly present mainly on behalf of my institution, which is the Czech National Film Archive, and as a public mission institution funded by the Ministry of Culture of the Czech Republic, it is our mission to research, restore, preserve, and make accessible the Czech and Czechoslovak film heritage. Among these things, what we do in order to make our collections accessible is digital restoration. And I hope at least some of you have had the chance to see the Diamonds of the Night as provided by Mina in the streaming of Liberating Cinema or other means, because and that's mainly the focus of my short intervention. There has been a great care and attention put into the restored version, which, as I said, I hope you have had the chance to see. Because as you can imagine, digital restoration, for those of you sort of familiar with what is called the heritage or archival titles, is a thing for the past 5 or 10 years. And you might have experienced different approaches to digital restoration. For us, as I mentioned, we are a public institution and archive operating for more than 70 years. The approach to digital restoration and the whole concept is very much based on looking at our films as heritage. That means that we try to follow a path defined by research, and some might call it even a rather conservative approach to digital restoration, because we don't feel we are in the position to really try to look the films better than they looked when they were first screened. Rather, we really focus on the preferably the original release of the film, and by doing that, we also keep many features of the individual titles making and production visible and present also in the restored version. This with Diamonds of the Night, it might not be as visible as with say older titles, but still there are numerous details where you might notice that different kinds of what you might call imperfections are present also in the restored version. But as I was trying to explain, following our mission in preserving and making accessible film heritage as a historical fact, we try to preserve everything that is inherent or was inherent to the individual film's production and distribution originally. So on one hand, digital restoration tools offer you a great variety of approaches and what is known as cleaning and retouches. But as I mentioned, we try to be rather on the conservative side of handling this, which means that generally speaking, we try to remove all the strains of time, all the damages and artifacts that have accumulated on the original artifacts that we use as sources for the digital restoration. But when it comes to various traces of the film's production, be it the camera work or the lab work, the laboratory work, which is especially important in this film, we try to preserve everything as we, based on the research we have and on the expertise we have, we believe is inherent to the film as a historical artifact. That's also connected to the reason why we restore films, and that is to make them accessible again in a form as close as possible to their slightly imaginary but still original look and feel and sort of aesthetical and formal and technical qualities. So that's also why we really see the aim of our digital restoration projects as bringing films back on screens. Ideally, that means theater screens or cinema screens, but at the same time, we are very happy that they are available then widely through all other different media, including streaming. So I hope you have had a chance to see the restored version, because in many respects, I think it really surpasses all the previously available digital or analog manifestations. I mean, those electronic ones. The way we very basically work with digital restoration is that we use the best available original material in this case, and in most of the cases that means the original camera negative or original image negative, and with sound it's similar. Usually it's the original sound negative that we use, and then we pick a specific period print, what is also called as the vintage print. I'll get back to that in a moment, because it's especially relevant for the restoration of Diamonds of the Night. But at the same time, I'd just like to mention that also other titles that we might be mentioning tonight have been restored already, especially The Distant Journey by Alfred Radok, but also The Shop on the Main Street, which Mina also mentioned, by Kadar and Klos. That project was undertaken together with the Slovak Film Institute, because it's a Czechoslovak title made by Slovak authors. So it's maybe Jonathan might have eventually a comment on that distinctions, but generally speaking, I'm happy that we try to stick to the Czechoslovak heritage as a notion and a form, and then then collaborate closely with our Slovak partners in Bratislava on specific restoration projects, which, as in the case of the shop on the main street, sort of concern both the Czech and Slovak productions. As I mentioned, as being an archival institution and having this approach, we always base our restoration on research. The research concerns both the actual physical film elements that have been preserved not only with us, with our archive, but also in our partner FIAF archives. That is especially useful for certain titles which have had a complicated history of distribution and might have not been preserved ideally in our archive. I would mention our project of Extase, where we were really dependent on the close collaboration with numerous FIAF archives. In the case of Diamonds of the Night, this was not so necessary because we had preserved both the original camera negative, so the sort of shooting elements, and also a number of what I mentioned, the period film prints or vintage prints. That is prints that film prints, positive prints that we can date and establish as being manufactured, produced, and also ideally distributed in the first time, the first distribution window of the set title. This is a tricky thing with every film we work on, because as you might know, in the classical film production process, the camera negative is further what is called graded or color timed. So it's not only that you can sort of restore a film based on this original element. It's ideal when you have this period vintage print to work as a reference. And as you might recall, the aesthetic qualities of Diamonds of the Night, the film is very specific in especially how it handles contrast, how it handles the different tones between a very stark black and white contrast images and then a more subtle graduation within the grayscale. So actually establishing how the film should look in the digital form is very much based on the research of the period vintage prints that, as I mentioned, we use as a reference for the digital restoration. But in this case, it was also very much based on research in the paper documents, in classical archival documents, and on oral history projects, because we were lucky to be able to work with Štěpán Kučera, the son of the principal DOP of the film, Jaroslav Kučera, who himself would be a great topic for another workshop, because his work really spans throughout not only the period of the Czechoslovak New Wave, but also throughout very different genres and very different approaches. But the credit of the Diamonds of the Night very much rests also on his shoulders in his camera work and sort of the conception of the image, which was very detailed, very detailed in not only the technical script, the shooting script, but also in different various notes and other paper documents that attest to how the film was actually produced. And the production, I mentioned in the beginning that part of the film production is always takes place not only on the shooting set, but also in the film lab. And what is noteworthy with the Diamonds of the Night is the fact that the original camera negative was partly for the most contrasty, stark images developed in a sound bath, a sound developer, to attain the specific image quality. So for those of you more familiar with the work of Jaroslav Kučera, or just generally speaking, I would anyone with the interest in film photography, I would recommend the work of his, and also some literature that has recently came out on his work, because he was able to really incorporate various experimental procedures, and experimental really in the fact that, as I mentioned, they used the sound developer to develop parts of the image negative, which then produced these specific qualities of the more serial parts of the film. And this is an important fact to bear in mind when you work on the restoration, and this is an important fact to preserve and keep in the restored version, because it very much sort of affects the aesthetics. When you work on the restoration, and when you go through the research, you also study not only the actual production, but also the distribution of the film, and to really make sure that the version that you are presenting nowadays is as close as possible to the original one. And one thing, maybe last thing I would mention in terms of this research undertaken for Diamonds of the Night was, again, the fact that as the Czechoslovak film industry was a centralized, monopolized institution, every film had to go through a certain sort of approval process. And within that approval process, it was specifically, it wasn't as much the maybe storytelling or specific narrative strategies of the film. It was really the visuals of the film that have sort of gotten Jan Němec and his team into some troubles during the approvals. And again, there was this discussion on how specific the visual qualities are, and there was some sort of concerns expressed by the approving committee that this would be a unique case in terms of visual formalism and visual qualities that not many other filmmakers would follow suit in terms of experimenting as much with the image and with the image expressivity. And again, then these specific qualities of the film were, among with other things, the reason for Diamonds of the Night not being present in the Czechoslovak distribution after 1968. This very important 1968, 1969. This very sort of important moment in terms of closing down the cultural uprising, the spirit of the Czechoslovak New Wave and the culture of the 1960s. So strictly speaking, we don't talk about the Diamonds of the Night as a prohibited film or a film that would have been put into a vault. It's not the same case as, for example, The Larks on the String or All My Good Countrymen, which are maybe the most famous titles which really were not being sort of released into cinemas in the 1960s. But the Diamonds of the Night had a very successful distribution history throughout the 1960s, but then disappeared as the Czechoslovak film industry was a centralized working. That means those certain titles were simply not put into distribution again. So and they have obviously gathered a lot of international attention, and that's what I believe Jonathan would be talking about in a second.
Great.
So I try to I think I would end now, and sort of if there are specific questions, maybe from those of you who had a chance to see the restored version recently, or anything that I mentioned, I'm happy to answer those, and I'll be available throughout the workshop for anything else.
Great, thank you very much, Matěj. That was excellent. Very concise and insightful points that you provided. Very happy to open it up to the floor now for any questions that we might have for Matěj at this point. Yes.
Hello, Matěj.
Hello, Jon. Hello, Kamil.
Nice to see you. I just wanted to say that once again, I'm completely in love with your opening restoration credit title, where you say that when you digitize this film, you don't try to erase the history of the film, which I think is very important. And I think that you state this in front of all your digital restorations is really very commendable, I think. I have a question when you said about when the film was originally produced and processed, that the negative was developed in a sound bath. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. I mean, I can understand if the negative was maybe processed in a positive bath instead of a negative bath, because then you can achieve bigger contrast. But what do you mean by sound bath? I don't really understand.
Well, from my understanding, they were experimenting with. It was indeed a positive bath intended for a sound processing in a way. I can look into the notes I have on that. It's I know they had some shooting tests that also Jaroslav Kučera sort of worked on privately. There's this sort of great study, a book published out of it even, of him, of his sort of private film experiments that he then put into use in his work with both Jan Němec or Věra Chytilová. And I think they had this special arrangement on within Barrandov Labs to really try different developers and to sort of mix them in a way they would find suitable. So this is there's no as it wasn't really an official procedure. This is more in the line of, as I said, oral history, or sort of memories and stories connected to the film, as sort of that. Maybe to be more precise and correct, we should state that there was a lot of experimentation going on concerning the developing process, not to sort of be too misleading in terms of the actual bath composition. I wouldn't dare to venture into that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Matěj.
Thank you, Jon, and saying hi to my dear FIAF colleagues. Any
further questions for Matěj at this point?
I have one.
Yes, please.
With my limited interaction with working with film elements, I'm always struck by the little surprises or complications that comes with working with elements. Were there any surprises or complications you discovered working with these vintage elements? Was there anything that stood out to you with that?
Great question.
There's obviously so many. I mean, with Diamonds of the Night specifically, I might have overstated its distribution success or sort of distribution history in Czechoslovakia, which means that, I mean, the film, it's not and you wouldn't imagine it being the most popular film of the 1960s, which obviously has a great effect on how many film prints were produced and in which condition the film sort of is kept until today. It's this slight irony of the more demanding experimental titles, and not to speak of the really banned or prohibited titles, that their original elements are generally in a much better shape than for the more popular titles, out of which hundreds of prints were produced. Or then when you get into other duplication elements, when you have the positive prints produced from a duplicate negative, for example. This wasn't the case with the Diamonds of the Night. So I would say it's more what is extremely demanding in these films, which are not sort of speaking of their cinematography, standardized really, is really choosing the best suitable vintage print, or sort of trying to approximate the visual impression of the film based on more prints that you have at your disposal. You obviously really want to be sure that you date these prints well, that you understand if there is any degradation with the individual prints, so you don't get carried away by a specific film element that has degraded in a specific way that would then influence your idea about the restored version too much. So in this case, as I mentioned, it was crucial to study the prints that were available, and to date them well, to not overdo the restoration and the grading, to really be sure that we have done everything that we sort of can vouch for, and that we can say is reasonable in terms of the digital post-production and the grading, because it can get sort of there's a very thin line between restoration and remastering, and it's easy to get carried away by the digital tools that one has at his or her disposal when working with a digital image, with the scan of the original element.
Thank you very much, Matěj. That was very good. I'm sure there's other questions. We'll come back to that, and we'll have a chance at the end to address anything further that we have. I have one or two that I might have to ask before the session's out, but we'll wait till we get there. I would really I'd like to hand it over to Jonathan Owen, who joins us right now from Toronto. So welcome. As Mina mentioned briefly, he's an independent scholar and writer specializing in Czech, Slovak, and other European cinemas. He has researched and taught at the Universities of Exeter and St. Andrews and the Curators Institute of Art. He has contributed to numerous books and journals, and regularly produces extras for Blu-ray and DVD releases. He is currently preparing an article on the international reception of Polak's sci-fi films. He's going to help us work our way through the political and historical context of the Czechoslovak New Wave, liberalization, Prague, and Warsaw Pact invasion. He's going to look at the institutional context of the New Wave, as well as its aesthetic influences and some of its key filmmakers, along with some of the international connections, the Oscar successes, French response, Western co-productions, etc. So without much further ado, I'd love to hand it over for Jonathan. And again, once he's given us his insight and his wisdom, we'll open it up to the floor for questions. So Jonathan, please.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you to Mina for inviting me to speak today. Yeah, I'd like to say a little bit about the various contexts, I think, that underpin the New Wave, and to introduce some of the major filmmakers and themes. So the New Wave is often seen to begin in 1963, and the first New Wave film is often considered to be actually a Slovak film, and I think this ties in well with what Matěj was saying about the fact that this is, I think, very much a Czechoslovak phenomenon. So the first film is often considered to be Stefan Uher's film Sunshine in a Net, which was released in 1963. And also in 1963-64, we start to see the debut features of people like Miloš Forman, Věra Chytilová, and indeed Jan Němec with Diamonds of the Night, which was his first feature film. So I think the wider context for the New Wave is the context of political reform in the 1960s. And there are various sort of determinants of that. This is happening in the wider context of the political thaw across the Eastern Bloc, although this is something that happens rather belatedly in Czechoslovakia. I think another crucial impetus was the economic crisis in Czechoslovakia in the early 60s, which prompted a call for economic reforms to change the command system of the communist economy. And I think this kind of led to a wider interest in reform at other levels, including politically. So I think all of this context of liberalization reform helps to, I think, create the conditions in which filmmakers do feel empowered, emboldened to push boundaries. And of course, this ultimately culminates in the Prague Spring of 1968, when Alexander Dubček replaces the hardline figure of Antonín Novotný as the first secretary of the Communist Party. Dubček inaugurates what was really an unprecedented program for political reform and democratization under the slogan of socialism with a human face. So this is really, I think, the kind of liberalization process that enables the New Wave to exist. Now, it's also worth noting that filmmakers did not enjoy a completely free ride in the 60s, and there were still cases of films that were censored and that were officially condemned. And I think Němec is probably the most singular example of a filmmaker who was, even in the 60s, working against the grain of what was permissible in this system. I think there are some other important institutional contexts as well. I think the film school FAMU is a very important institution. This is where most of the New Wave filmmakers were trained, and FAMU is a film school that has a world famous reputation. It has also educated filmmakers from other regions. For instance, a lot of the prominent Yugoslav filmmakers of the 1980s were also educated at FAMU. The Polish filmmaker Agnieszka Holland was educated there. Now, I think what FAMU did for the New Wave in Czechoslovakia was, apart from providing important teachers, and people like Milan Kundera, for instance, were teaching at FAMU, it also gave them the ability to see films that they could not have seen elsewhere. So there were French and Italian films that were shown at FAMU that would not have been possible to see outside of the film school, that would have probably been banned or somehow unavailable for wider release. I think it's also important to note that the film industry itself was changing in the 60s too. So from the mid-50s onwards, the Czechoslovak film industry was increasingly decentralized. And so by the early 60s, you have films being made in small production units. So these would be like small groups which would have script advisors, they would have production chiefs, and essentially they were a quite autonomous, self-contained way of making films. So I think that this is one of the important contexts for this kind of independent minded filmmaking. So you have that combination of state subsidy along with a very independent and increasingly autonomous context in which filmmakers could work. Now, to say a little bit about some of the influences and artistic inspirations, the New Wave was not really a movement that had a kind of coherent artistic program. It didn't have a formulated aesthetic in the way that other filmmakers often have. One comment that is quite well known that was made by Miloš Forman was that in many ways the New Wave were reacting against something. They were reacting against the negative inspiration of the bad films of the previous era. So this was as much a rejection of the past as it was a consciously formulated program. That said, there are some important artistic influences coming both from outside, from other countries, but also from Czech and Slovak culture themselves. I think the Italian neorealism was one important influence. So was French cinema verite. I think Mina has already mentioned the surrealist movement, which I think is important both in terms of international surrealists like Louis Buñuel, but also in terms of the native tradition of surrealism and avant-garde art in Czechoslovakia itself, where surrealism has had a long history stretching from the 1930s really into the present day. I think if you look at a filmmaker like Jan Němec, I think you can quite clearly see the influence of surrealism. One of his idols as a filmmaker was Buñuel. And I think you can also see the influence of Kafka too, perhaps not as overtly in Diamonds of the Night as in his two films that follow this, but I think Kafka, it's a very important point of reference. And again, I think this is part of the context of the 1960s where people like Kafka, those kinds of artists who in a previous era had been banned or had been declared unacceptable could now be published, could now be written about. So I think this all feeds into that artistic influence on the new wave. Now, if I wanted to draw like a very schematic portrait of the new wave, I might say that there are two sort of opposing different stylistic or artistic tendencies. On the one hand, you have the influence of what we might call a realistic kind of filmmaking, which is influenced by cinema verite. And I think that is embodied most obviously in the work of Miloš Forman, who made films that had a very improvisatory flavor, used cinema verite techniques. At the other extreme, there is a style of filmmaking which is much more interested in allegory and in stylization and in experimentation. So I think those are kind of the two sort of wings, if you like, of new wave aesthetics. In practice, I think those two separate tendencies are often quite hard to disentangle. And I think a film like Diamonds of the Night is a good example of that, where you do have, I think, techniques that one could describe as cinema verite techniques, but being used, I think, towards the end of stylization and experimentation. So I think in practice, these two different stylistic tendencies are often woven together quite carefully. And it's worth noting too that one of the cinematographers who worked on this film was Miroslav Ondříček, who was also Miloš Forman's cinematographer and later went on to work with the director Lindsay Anderson in the UK. And that brings us nicely, I think, to the international impact and connections that the new wave has had. It did have a very positive international reception at the time. I think most notably, that's reflected in the fact that there were two Oscar successes for Czechoslovak films. So firstly, for the Shop on Main Street in 1966, and then for Closely Observed Trains in 1967. And also increasingly, as the 60s went on, there was more interest from Western distributors, Western co-producers. So by the late 60s, we see a number of Czechoslovak films being made in co-production with France and Italy, and even in one case with the United States. Now, I think that is worth noting, the international reception, because I think the fact that these films did get a positive response in the West did give the new wave filmmakers a certain degree of license and a certain degree of protection. And this is a point that's been made by the critic Michal Bregant, who has said that what the new wave offered to the Czechoslovak regime was positive representation on the outside. And I think this enabled the filmmakers to be as bold as they were. Now, of course, this really comes to a head with the Soviet-ordered invasion in August 1968, which was an attempt to destroy the reform movement, to destroy the Prague Spring. What's interesting with that is that in the short term, the filmmakers' freedoms were not really affected. So you have this period really from the middle of 1968 until really the end of 69, when filmmakers were still quite free to make audacious and challenging films. And so, in fact, some of the most radical new wave films fall in that period of 68, 69, even early 1970. By about 1970, the impact of normalization, which is the attempt to restore the former orthodoxies and the hardline policy of the previous era, that really makes its impact. And so in consequence, many filmmakers are not able to work. Many filmmakers ultimately emigrate. And this is really what happened with Jan Němec, who was ultimately forced to make a choice between going abroad and being arrested. So of course, he made the choice to go abroad. He went initially to West Germany and then later to the US, and then later in the 1990s came back to Czechoslovakia. And I think if we're talking about Němec as a representative of the new wave, I think in many ways he is one of the most exemplary figures, in that one could say that the kind of filmmaking that he pursued in the 1990s when he came back to Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic as it became, was still very much in that tradition of independent-minded filmmaking. So for me, I would say Němec is very much an exemplary new wave artist.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you so much. That was I was just going to give you the 2-minute warning. So. Oh. Well done. Well timed. We've got a few minutes for some questions now. It was very insightful. Who would like to begin? Does anyone have a question for Jonathan at this point?
I have. Hello.
Hi, Emilia, please.
Yes. Hello, Jonathan, and thank you very much for your presentation, and to Matěj as well. I wanted to ask you how common it is to use surrealism or the elements of surrealism in talking about Holocaust. Is that not a bit unusual approach, or is it?
Yes. I mean, I think. I mean, we have I think an important surrealist influence, I think, on a lot of new wave filmmakers. I think where it does intersect, I think, with representations of the Holocaust, I think is something that we can find in Diamonds of the Night. I think we also see it in a film like The Cremator as well. I would say it is unusual, and I would say it's perhaps not exceptional in that I can feel that other filmmakers, I think, were doing similar things in France, for instance. So I think maybe a film like Night and Fog by Alain Resnais, I think, could be seen to have a surrealist dimension to it as well. But I think if we're looking at, what makes these representations challenging, what makes them unusual, I think that is one of the things that does make them unusual. I think if we go back to some of the original qualities of surrealism, I think we're talking about, juxtaposition, and we're talking about irrationality. And I think what's interesting in the case of Czech surrealism, I think one of the things that made Czech surrealism distinctive was that it saw itself as much more concerned with the real. This is one thing that Petr Král, the film critic, has written about in relation to Czech surrealism that makes it different from, say, the original André Breton tradition. So he says that where the Bretonian tradition of surrealism was much more interested in the ideal and in dream, Czech surrealism was much more concerned with reality and the irrationality of political systems and existing reality in a very kind of dark and morbid way. So I think there is a sort of a morbid quality to Czech surrealism, which I think does distinguish it. Now, I guess a distinction should be made between the actual surrealists who were practicing in the 60s and 70s and 80s and some of the new wave filmmakers, and certain Czech surrealists have often maintained a kind of distance between themselves and some of the new wave films, which they feel are a little bit like secondhand surrealism. But on the other hand, I think if we look at a film like Diamonds of the Night, if we look at a film like The Cremator, I think we can situate them in that sensibility where I think we're looking at the grotesque, we're looking at the absurd, but we're doing it in relation to historical reality. We're using that grotesqueness to emphasize atrocities, to emphasize the irrationalities of history. So I would say there is a kind of a connection there, but I agree that it is somewhat unusual. I think, you know, these are not usually two things that we put together.
Great, thank you very much. Another question for Jonathan.
Sure, I can pose one. Thank you so much for this really interesting talk. I specialize in Polish cinema, so Czech cinema is not my area of specialty, but I know that in the Polish case, the debut film was really important, right? The debut film, it meant where you might be able to make films later, whether or not you would be a success, right, in that film industry. And so I find it fascinating that Jan Němec chose this subject for his debut film, because it seems pretty high stakes, right? And so I was curious if you could say something about that, right? What it meant to make a debut about a subject that, if not completely forbidden, was maybe not the subject that would lend itself to a, you know, to kind of approbation or praise by the authorities.
Very good question. Yeah, I think that one thing that seems consistent with Němec all the way through, I think, is that he was a provocateur. And I think this kind of subject matter was itself, you know, I think very new in the 1960s. I think this was one way in which filmmakers and other artists were challenging, you know, previous orthodoxies about representation. I mean, the Holocaust had not been a welcome subject. The treatment of Jewish persecution of Jews had not been a welcome subject at all in the 1950s, nor was it later in the 70s either. So I think I see this as part of a conscious decision to really, you know, make that statement that he's doing something different. It seems to have been consistent, I think, with Němec's behavior at FAMU, where I think he was always pushing against the boundaries of what he could do. And I believe that he said that he, you know, made every film in Czechoslovakia that he made very quickly because he was very conscious that he was working against the odds and that there was always that risk of censorship. So I think that to me, it's very consistent with that audacious approach, really. And Arnošt Lustig, who wrote the story on which this is based, I mean, I think was also quite a new writer, really, in that, I mean, his work started to be published in the late 1950s. So I think this was really a kind of statement of purpose in many ways that, you know, he was going to do something different.
Thank you very much. That was very good, extraordinarily insightful, and great questions as well. Last but not least, Šárka, who is a PhD candidate at the Department of Czech and Comparative Literature, the Faculty of Arts at Charles University in Prague. She focuses on Czechoslovak and Czech literature and film on topics of the Holocaust. She's going to talk us through Diamonds of the Night in the context of the 1960s Czechoslovak cinema, the uniqueness of the film, which I think ties nicely with the recent question that Jonathan just answered. Going to look at the narrator of the film, the images and the camera angles, time in the film as well, and some of the contrasts in the film that exist. So we're going to get right into the heart of Diamonds of the Night. So without any further ado, Šárka, please.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, Mina, for inviting me here. First, I would like to I'll try to put Diamonds of the Night in the context of 1950s and 1960s. In Czechoslovakia, after Second World War and after the communist coup in 1948, there was a strong link of post-war Soviet anti-Semitism in Czechoslovakia, and the topic of Jewishness and the Holocaust was pushed aside in the 50s. And if we well, basically only The Distant Journey was made during this time, which obviously is one of the best films about this topic till these days. But with the 50s, only a couple of films slightly hinting the topic of the Second World War and the Holocaust were made. And if there were any films made about the war, they were, you know, heroizing the heroes from resistance, let's say. But then something interesting happens in the 1960s. The films that were made in this decade, they were portraying different heroes, let's say ordinary people, as were here mentioned, you know, the shop on Main Street, or the Transport from Paradise, you know, heroes and main protagonists of these films, as well as in Diamonds of the Night. Those are no, you know, not the big heroes, but ordinary people who, you know, traumatized people fighting against the regime, against war, against death, and so on. So there's very specific shift in how the heroes are portrayed in the 1960s. And this decade, 1960s, was very prolific in making films with the, let's say, set piece of the Second World War and the Holocaust. About 10 or 15 films were made with this topic, and most of them are these days treasure of Czechoslovak cinematography. And even in this context, Diamonds of the Night are really a unique film. The film is unique because, as you have seen, there is no linear narration whatsoever. It is an experimental film. Sometimes it's compared to Buñuel's and Delusion Dog, because there is an attempt of, you know, the stream of consciousness filming, which was in something really extraordinary in 1960s. Jan Němec said in one interview that he was fully aware that the film he made, Diamonds of the Night, wasn't for a mass audience. He was aware that only a little group of people would see that and would appreciate it. And he said that he wanted that every viewer would put a bit of himself in the viewing and kind of put himself in the, you know, in the shoes of the two main protagonists. He really placed high demands on his viewers. What I like to quote what he really tried to film, quote, "I tried to give a deeper depiction of a man, his fate, and feelings. I attempted to create a multi-dimensional cinematic study of loneliness, fear, physical repression, homesickness, the battle for preserving human existence, and the expression of cruelty towards man. I wanted to portray the mental states of a person exposed to difficult, inhuman conditions and extreme situations, to portray the psychological pressure on people as well. Therefore, part of the story does not take place in the realm of reality, but in the realm of the imagination," unquote. Now, a brief introduction. Now I'd like to talk about the narrator of the film, which is, let's say, unique in the fact that there is no linear narration, no voice of narrator. It is a visually conceived film, and the narrator are the images in there. And there are, I can see there 3 different kinds of work with a camera. First kind, camera, it's kind of an objective camera, external objective narrator, but the second one is the subjective camera, where you can see by the lenses of camera what the main protagonists see, how they run, what they see while they are running. This is a handheld camera, which is, you know, like shaking and makes you, like, kind of puts you in the shoes of those two protagonists. And thirdly, the camera is a living third person, again, the handheld camera that travels with the boy and records them. Sometimes you can see that the camera is faster than the two protagonists and kind of like a third person watching them. Well, this raw camera kind of suggest the impression of news footage, but we must see that the scenes and shots are highly stylized. It is not a documentary film. It is not a newsreel. The film really hangs on the balance between the raw authenticity and visual stylization, which you have to keep on mind. That its rawness is stylization. Also, I think what is worth noting that the kind of documentary effect of the film is also made by a special film reel with a specific chemical composition that the director chose. According to Danduta, this structure creates an impression that there is some kind of a wall standing between you as a viewer and the film, and that you can really see. It's a see-through wall, but there still is a wall, and you as a viewer kind of should have a feeling that you cannot do how to put it, that you really cannot influence anything in the film, but not only you as a viewer, but also the director cannot influence anything. You as a viewer, you cannot feel anything. You can't have any compassion, for example, with the two main protagonists. But the director kind of possibly wanted you to think that he doesn't influence anything as well. That the film, lies somehow out of reach. I will get to that later, but at this point, I think it's important to note the chiming of the bells that you can hear throughout all the film. It's kind of keeps you raising questions. What is that? Is it the voice of destiny, of fate, of God? One of the, I think that Danduta also noted that it's somehow states that what is happening is only inside what is surrounded by the chiming of the bells, and that it really is out of reach, and you can't do anything about what is happening. Now I'd like to move to the soundtrack. As you have seen, there is very little dialogues. Actually, it takes 13 long minutes before there is a single word can be heard from the first of the boys. The noises you can hear there, the train, the rustling of the leaves, gunshots, gunfires, or sometimes the bells, birds, and also the biting of old men. And sometimes, and in the film, the sound is more prominent than the image. There you can hear that the sounds are much louder than they can possibly be in the reality. For example, when the boys hear the old German man biting, those noises really are very, very, very loud, and it should create a feeling for you that that's how the boys perceive it, because they are exhausted, they are hungry, they are on the brink of death, and they are hallucinating, and they have different state of mind, and they hear things differently than they are in reality. Now I'd like to move to the capturing the time in the film. Well, we can find several different plays which interweave. There are those imaginations and visions, or even hallucination, you can call it, such as the repeated vision of possibly killing or not killing the German woman, or this vision of boys being shot. Then there's the plane of thoughts and recollections of pre-war Prague, of pre-war life, and the present moment. And the recollections of boys, they repeat. They not repeat in the same way, but their repetitions are very, very similar. And we can read it in a way that the boys are so exhausted that they simply don't have any mental capacity to think of any other recollections. They just, there's just one or two things going through your head on and on, again and again, and you can't think of anything else. As I said, those planes, as they interweave and they make an interconnected whole. Gelman even speaks about poetics of surrealism in this regard. which is again another unique fact about the film. Now let's move to the numerous contrasts we can find in the film, because there are contrasts from the beginning to the end of the film. As also Matěj was talking about it, the light and the dark. For example, or even light, not even light, but overlit city. You see there very white snow, and then there is the darkness of the forest. When boys are running, the forest is usually very dark, and then there's some recollections of pre-war Prague, which is, you know, overlit, or the tram is overlit, and or the really very white snow. The great contrast of silence and noise. There's, for example, there's one scene when there's like really quiet, and then you hear the bell ring. There's some this noise. It really goes into your head, because before there's for a couple of seconds there's really quiet, nothing happens, and then there is really this terrible pinching noise of bell. And another contrast of a noise. And of course, the chiming bells, like on and on, from the beginning subtitles to the end, you very often hear the bells. Another contrast we can find with the city on one hand and the nature or forest on another hand. They interweave once again. For example, I found interesting when the boys lie down in the forest one night, and they are putting on them some, you know, parts of trees because they are cold. And the first boy dreams, or just has this recollection of cushions, and these white beautiful cushions he saw in a window in Prague. And again, it is the contrast of him. He is exhausted, and he is you know, he is dirty. And then there is this contrast with white, beautiful, and possibly very warm sheets that would be beautiful for him to cover in them. Another contrast that we can find is this one of a movement, this one of being static. You know, the boys are always running. Even in recollections, they are very often running. The boy he's running through Prague, he's running down the stairs, he is running through the tram, or he is going up the stairs. So again, he is moving. And on the other hand, I think the most I would say striking contrast of a movement and a static point is when the two boys are standing still against the wall with their hands up, and they're doing nothing because they can't. They have to stand there, and in the room there are those old men from Volkssturm. They're eating, so their jaws are moving. Then they are clapping their hands. They are dancing. They are singing. And again, another contrast of, let's say, elderly and youth. Again, one of them. It is worth noting that Diamonds of the Night was written as on the motifs of short story written by Arnošt Lustig, a Holocaust survivor. It is on the motifs of short story Darkness Casts No Shadow in Czech nemá stín. And what is worth noting that Arnošt Lustig, a Holocaust survivor, he wrote really many books about not only his experience, but about the experience of being a Jew, and about surviving or not surviving the Holocaust. And many of these books were filmed, and many of them were filmed in the 60s, such as Dita Sachs, for example, or The Prayer for Catherine Horowitz, and Transport from Paradise, also on the motifs of his book. And here, The Diamonds of the Night. What is interesting for me is that in the other mentioned films, the Holocaust, the Second World War, and Jewishness are much more prominent. But in Diamonds of the Night, it is pushed aside. There is a shift in literally pretext, where there is a scene also present in the film, but slightly changed, when the two boys come with the German mayor, and the German mayor orders them to undress, and he finds out that one of the boys is circumcised. So obviously he has to be Jewish, but nothing like that is present in the film. Also, that we see that they are running from a prison train. Again, that doesn't mean that they're Jewish. So the fact of Jewishness or even the Holocaust is really pushed aside. I wouldn't say that it is because of more or less present post-war anti-Semitism in Czechoslovakia. I would say that Jan Němec wanted to make a more general allegory, and that is simply that, you know, the Jewishness or non-Jewishness was not important for his aim.
Great, thank you so much, Šárka. I think we'll bring it there. That was an excellent point to end on, and we'll open up for some questions, because it gave us a lot to think about, and we want to leave time for a general discussion here. Very quickly, maybe 20 seconds, if you could, as looking at this idea of this demand that the director placed on his viewers, and this need to kind of upset and confront. It sounds like this goes back in a long tradition, all the way back to Socrates. This idea that you kind of confront, and I'm just wondering whether there was any specific intentionality around that, and what sort of tradition, or whether he drew any connections with you know, a particular tradition of thought, which would draw upon this idea of provocation as a necessary tool to sort of bring about an awakening or a sense of encounter in some respect.
I'll have to think this through.
Okay, perfect. Well, listen, while you're doing that, we can get another question. It's just an interesting thing, I think. Okay, anybody else have a question for Šárka at this point? Yes, Barbara.
Hi, can you all hear me? Sorry, I had some issues with my, you know, Zoom constellation. Hi, I'm a PhD candidate at Yale University, where I work on Czechoslovak avant-garde art. Excuse me?
No, go ahead.
Is it okay?
I think
Okay, so I work on Czechoslovak avant-garde art and surrealism also, so it's been so fascinating to hear how it reoccurs in this way, and as well as cinema. And thank you so much for your beautiful analysis of the film. I was really struck by the points you were making, especially your sort of emphasis on the way the film is mapping the psychological terrain of the protagonists, both in the visual realm as well as in the soundscape, which is really powerful. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more about the way the film emphasizes the almost haptic quality and kind of texture of the fabrics and, you know, materials that appear in the close-ups, and whether you can think of any other films in the Czechoslovak New Wave, for example, where that create this very visceral kind of strong relationship between the environment and the psychological states of the characters, because it's quite striking and unique.
Thank you, Barbara. I honestly can't think of any other film, because Diamonds of the Night are really unique in this point of view. What you said is very interesting. Thank you for that. You are right that if I understood well your question, that very often in the film you really got the feeling that you can like touch her, and it's haptic. Do I understand it correctly? I think that the most striking is when you can see the two boys walking in the forest, and the higher one with the foot he is, you know, like crunching his hand in the hand of his friend. I must admit, I'm not quite sure if it's so, because if you read the pretext, you know that the higher boy, let's say, or the second boy, has not an ill feat, but that it's that there is actually a nail in his boot, in the shoe, and that is why he is what's the word? Please help me. he is not walking correctly. It hurts him so badly because there's a nail in his shoe, and I'm not quite sure if it's so visible from the film if you don't read the pretext. But I guess that still it's understandable there. And this is, I think, the most haptic scene. Or which one do you think is the most haptic there?
For me, it was just even as a viewer, you know, getting these sort of shots, close-ups to that, where you almost feel the ground, where you feel the texture of the fabrics, you know, across different spaces. And I'm thinking it's a beautiful image that you pointed out with the sort of fingernails, you know, how he's grasping him. I was thinking about another film by Juráček and Schmidt, The End of August at Hotel Ozon, where there's also this emphasis on, you know, kind of the haptic engagement with nature and the environment. And there is the old woman who kind of touches a cross section of a tree and then there's really kind of also certain images where the sort of hands are emphasized with dirty fingernails when she's being buried. I don't know if you recall these scenes, but it's but I felt that this it never gets to the point of intense haptic engagement and sort of tactility of the image itself as in Diamonds of the Night. So yeah, but yeah, I agree that these are really powerful scenes that you were choosing.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions at this point for Šárka? I think we have time for one more. Great. Milia, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the lovely presentation. I have a question, and let me just see if I can put it concisely. You said something about the using of the certain chemicals to give this texture and this contrast. And I'm just wondering, I don't know if you can tell me that, or somebody else maybe, would that be possible to do nowadays, you know, when we don't have the same real, but everything is digital, you know, to achieve something like that? How do you achieve it?
Great question.
I don't know, maybe a question for Matěj.
Matěj, yeah, maybe we open it up to the larger group. Do you have any insight to provide us here, Matěj?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think the qualities that Barbara mentioned and that you are also pointing at, Milia, really have to do or might have to do with film grain and with the sort of film aesthetics. Maybe my established FIAF colleagues from other archives could comment on that. It's a tricky thing whether you could say that with digital imagery you can you know, you can attain and obtain similar results, but I think really here you have all of this combined together with, as we have discussed previously after my little talk, the specific care that has been put into really processing the film and also shooting the film, together with I mentioned the costume designer Ester Krumbachová, who is really a key figure for the whole aesthetics of Czechoslovak New Wave and many films produced in that period. And really, I mean, although, yeah, maybe at the first sight you might not think of it, the costumes, but they play an immense role in how the film is narrated. And I think that's what makes a great film work, that it really combines these professions and these sort of individual aesthetics together in a way that the film is able to convey both the emotion and the story together. Meaning, you have the costume designer, you have the director, you have the principal DOP and his crew. As also Jonathan mentioned, it wasn't only Jaroslav Kučera, it was really was there Vojnar? There was a third. blanking on that, but there were like three DOPs working on the film, together with the non-actors. It all adds together to what we can then feel from the film, and in the end, it might also be the fact that it was also physical in its production, in terms of minimal post-production effects, that it was really sort of shot on
on the ground, as it were. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So this physicality and the tactile quality, I think, is a combination of all the crafts that are required to make a great film.
Thank you very much.
I have a question to Matěj. Being a filmmaker, I have worked in 3 of my films. I have used Baseline, Scratch, and DaVinci for the different color grading software. So there are some software capability which can actually give the exact grain that film has. So my question to you, can the film grain be retained when you archive or digitize it? Or there is a substantial loss in the grain or the texture of the film when you digitize the film?
It very much depends on the element that you are using, but generally speaking, what you aim for is to sort of preserve and contain the grain of the shooting element of the original negative. You know that there's more grain that comes into the film experience coming from the duplication, with every duplication copying process, as film is an analog medium. You know it from Xerox machines and everything. There's more grain coming in, but generally speaking, what film archives try to do is to really know. Sorry, my video is lapsing, but is to work with film scanners with high enough resolution to capture the grain without then compromising for noise. There's like, you have in digital image, the smallest particle in the digital image is a noise particle, the little hum you might see in blacks and things like that.
Let me just stop you there for a second, Matěj. Thank you very much. Before she leaves, is Veronica still with us, or has she slipped off? Oh, that's a shame. I think she's.
No, I'm here.
Oh, Veronica, there you are. I see you. Great.
I just didn't want to look at my face.
No, please. So Veronica teaches at the University of Toronto. Is that correct? And has taught this film many times in her courses. And though it's a great honor and a pleasure and a surprise to have her with us tonight. So we thought that we would give her a couple of minutes. Maybe you had a question for the group, or you wanted to give us, a quick minute of some of the things that struck you throughout tonight, or in reviewing this film again.
I have to confess, I didn't see the new version, so I have to watch it tonight.
Okay, good, perfect.
But I thought it many times. I am very fond of the film. I think it's very unique. It's really, the influence of surrealism is clearly there. It's also the inspiration by Radok and his distant journey. I think that's a very important thing. It's also, I find it very interesting that they dealt with so-called Holocaust, and I hate the word, I don't use it. I'm using systematic extermination or whatever, but or extinction or whatever, but Holocaust is sacrifice by fire. So for me, it's not. But what Němec did is the collaboration with Lustig. Lustig did several films, Transport from Paradise, Diamonds of the Night, but before that you have Očenášek, Romeo, Julia, Tma, Krejčík. So that and Krejčík with Vyšší Princip. So there are different films before which are dealing with war, which are not presenting heroes. And I think Diamonds of the Night is exceptional for the fact that we have no individuals or individuals without a name. So that's what I think the experience of this time was. People became nameless. And the episode with the shoe, we are following it through the movie because he exchanged the shoes, and then all of a sudden the shoe is actually fateful, or no fateful, but it's for him the obstacle which cost them almost life, because they are throwing down because of the shoe. So I find the way how he weaves it into the narration without having clear presentation of cause and effect. We are guessing what's happening or what happened before. And the same thing is about the glimpses from Prague. They are memories, but they are not clearly defined memories because they are the way how it's shot. So yeah.
Wonderful.
Don't let me start it because I
yeah, no, thank you very much. We might have to reconvene another one, and I'm sure Mina can come up with something in this area that can get us all back together again. But yeah. Thank you very much.
Very welcome. I have to go, so
yeah, that's great. Good, thank you.
But I really appreciate it. The forum, it's wonderful. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Great. Stephen, if there's time, I have one comment and a question maybe that I think might round things off kind of nicely or connect us.
Okay, well, I'll let Mina decide. No, that's fine. Okay, I'll give you 30 seconds for your comment and your question, and then we can.
All right, I'll do my best.
Okay, go.
So on the level of, so the comment first is an attempt to maybe try to think through some of what Jonathan suggested with this idea of two tendencies in Czech New Wave cinema. And I think what Barbara brought up is really important. It seems to me that there's a number of films that are more in this haptic vein, because in this film, it's a bodily genre. It's a cinema of exhaustion. The bodies are constantly moving. And if we think of so much of the other Czech New Wave films, a lot of them are about creating beautiful images. And so I think that might be an interesting distinction, like which are the more visual films that place the images at a distance, and which are the ones that involve viewers haptically. And so you could think of something like Daisies as being a perfect mix of the two. So I just thought that was a really interesting new way to reformulate or re-theorize the Czech New Wave. But I think that the most important question for me, which I was really hoping this presentation would address, that I would like to ask to Šárka and to Jonathan, has to do exactly with the point that Šárka brought up, that in this film, the boys' Jewish identity is not clear, right? It's unclear if they're Jewish or Czech. Right. And I looked at the filmography, and the Fifth Horseman of Fear, which is one of the other great Czech New Wave Holocaust films, is exactly the year after this. And in that film, the Jewish identity of the protagonist is pretty evident, right? And pretty clear. And so I was just curious if we think maybe a little bit more transhistorically, right? What changes as the 60s go on that make that kind of individuation possible, right? And I agree with you, Šárka. I think in this case, Němec wanted to create a kind of universal story, and that's why he didn't choose to individuate it. But it's still, he's going out on a limb. It's such a touchy, sensitive subject to touch for a film debut. And maybe possibly this film made, the Fifth Horseman of Fear possible the following year. And in terms of its approach to the Holocaust, it is really unique. And the only other place that I see somebody making a film about the Holocaust using a similar aesthetic is Son of Saul very recently. And so I'm curious if you had any thoughts about the comparison to Son of Saul as another attempt to turn the Holocaust from a suite of images, from a black and white kind of distantiation of that experience, to something haptic and bodily.
Okay, well, I think there was probably 3 questions in there, but we'll forgive you for that. But that was
yeah, but they're
excellent points. Excellent points. No, it's very good. Jonathan, did you want to address it first?
Yeah, I really like the fact that you brought up the Fifth Horseman is Fear, because I think definitely I see that as you say, it's like a further progression in that. I think it's more explicitly about Jewishness and the persecution of Jewish characters, and I think that's marked in a way that it is not in the way that it's kept ambiguous, or it's not addressed as explicitly in Diamonds of the Night. So I think it may reflect the development in the 60s where, you know, filmmakers did become, I think, bolder as time went on. What's also interesting to me as well is the connection between those two films, because what I like with Fifth Horseman is Fear is that on the one hand, I think it does address that the specificity of Jewishness. So I think in that sense, it was a breakthrough. But I think at the same time, it's doing something similar. So in the sense that Šárka mentioned that there is this idea of universality, or this idea that, you know, we're addressing not just the Second World War and the Holocaust, but we're talking about totalitarianism in general. I think what's interesting is that in the Fifth Horseman is Fear, you have those shots at the beginning and the end, which clearly are modern Prague. They're clearly not, you're not seeing, you know, Prague at the time of the occupation. You're seeing, you know, very much modern images. And I think Brynik made a conscious decision in that film to have the Gestapo officers dressed in basically like in anonymous kind of like modern suits. So I think that's, for me, an interesting point about Fifth Horseman, in that I think it retains that same interest in making a universal statement. But as you say, I think it is an advance in terms of being able to represent Jewishness, which I think had really been a taboo subject, I think, in the previous decade. I think it was not a welcome, subject. I think the emphasis always had to be before on, you know, the Czechs, or on, you know, communists and political prisoners. And what's so tragic is that, I mean, after the New Wave, after the 60s, even in the 1980s, when you have Uri Hertz making The Night Overtook Me in, I think, 1983, 84, even then he was still, he still had a lot of difficulty with the Barrandov authorities in terms of trying to represent the Jewish experience. There was a lot of pressure on him to basically to make it about political prisoners and to make it about, you know, the persecution of communists and not about Jews. And so I think this period is really exceptional. And yes, I think Fifth Horseman is for me, I think, one of the greatest Holocaust films.
Great, thank you very much. Excellent discussion, and I want to thank all three of our contributors again at this point for enlightening us and taking us through this fascinating period in film, in Czechoslovak film history, looking at the new wave and looking at these various forms of representation. Thank you for the contributions to the group. Very insightful comments and questions as well, which is always very helpful and very welcome. Wrapping up, I'll hand it over to the esteemed chair of this wonderful organization, Mina, to lead us on into the good night.
Steve, thank you very much. You're very kind and you've done a wonderful job. And thank you, everyone. I wanted to thank everybody who are wonderful presenters tonight. Matěj, I really liked your points about kind of especially the restoration process and kind of what goes on in the archives. I think this is very helpful, especially people who do not work in archives. So, and then Jonathan as well, I loved as well how you kind of worked out the points about, you give us context, but also then spoke about the relationship. This is precisely something I kind of wanted you to get to, and you did. And so I don't know how this, this worked out wonderfully without me ever saying anything. So how you worked out this relationship between surrealism and kind of more serious representations of events like the historical chapters like the Holocaust. So this was really wonderful. And then Šárka, again, your detailed film analysis, this was unprecedented, really great. And I think I liked also, I thank everybody else as well who contributed. I mean, Masha, Barbara, Matthias, Victoria, Camille, everyone who contributed during this talk. This is wonderful. I think also I liked your distinction that you said that we can kind of make a distinction between the two films. I think maybe on the one side we can put Uher, I don't know, that's a thought for future. Whether on the one camp we can say there's Uher, Miloš Forman, Ivan Passer, and then the other Juracek, Schmidt, Brynik, Němec. So I don't know, I wonder. And where is the kind of, what are the filmmakers that reconcile us? I think Masha recommended Chytilova, perhaps also Jaromil Jireš, but I think this is something for future debate as well. But I wanted to thank you all, and I hope, this will be recorded and will be available online. And I hope we will all meet again each other in future. I will leave it, I will ask Steve as well, if he's all right with this, we're a bit over time, but My kind of question, I had a final question, if we can, on top of all the final questions, if I can just ask, and maybe it can be left open, or if anyone wants to address it, it might be useful. My question is, in what way are these representations that we've talked about of the Holocaust in the Czechoslovak New Wave similar and or different to representations in Czechoslovak cinema before and after the New Wave? And if you want to take that further, how do these representations challenge our understandings of the Holocaust, and as many of you mentioned, totalitarian regimes in relation to other world cinemas? So what we've seen, I don't know, there's famous examples like Schindler's List, you know, but I mean, I'll leave this up to you. Any of our presenters that want to say anything, you're welcome to, please.
It might be a chance for Šárka to come in and also address Matěj's previous comment too, before we, in order to wrap up.
I'm thinking there's anything I haven't said about representations of the Holocaust before and after New Wave. I think that important is to see the shift in the heroization. I'm sorry, I have to say that in the next room there are my two little boys, and they're shouting so loudly that I can barely help my concentration. But I'll try for a couple of final minutes, as it is bedtime for them, and they're really shouting there. I think that in the 60s, for me the most interesting thing is how the protagonists act and react, let's say, not only with the Holocaust, but also with the regime, with the totalitarian regime. For example, we mentioned a couple of times Zbigněk Břiných. He made three very, very interesting films concerning Second World War and the Holocaust: the Transport from Paradise, The Fifth Rider is Fear, and I Justice. And the first one, he said that kind of is about the ghetto around us. I mean, like that you are physically in a ghetto, as the Transport from Paradise takes place in Theresienstadt, or in Czech Terezín, and the Fifth Rider, or the Fifth Horseman, is Fear, kind of talks about the inner ghetto that the Jews were put in during the Holocaust, or during the late 30s and the beginning of the 40s, before they were kind of exterminated.
Thank you. I think that wraps it up. I mean, in a very difficult way, very nicely. So I think we can leave with that. And what I kind of wanted us also to see, and I kind of put that in this whole workshop, and why I chose Diamonds of the Night, and what struck me most about it, apart from that fabulous opening tracking shot that it's one of the best I've ever seen, is the ending and how these boys walk on. And this has always stuck with me. And it's that kind of moment, even if they die, their soul lives. So, and this is kind of in this moment where it's really something where it touches on something existential and transcendent, and on the realm of the spiritual life. This is something I think is very important. So, and I'm very happy we were able to talk about this today, and I really look forward to seeing you and welcoming you next year, when we'll kind of have our full program and more films and more discussions and more panelists. And I also recommend, Matěj mentioned Esther Kumbachova. Dina's essay is kind of, you didn't intend this, but Dina's essay is also spot on in bringing out kind of the big role, and Dina brings this out well, like that Esther Kumbachova had in Jan Němec's work, and also as his partner. So I'd recommend you read this after. I've pasted it in there. I can paste it again in case we've had a long chat. But otherwise, I thank you again, and I hope we'll see each other again soon. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much.